September 15, 1944. Japanese Sergeant Takashi Yamamoto watched in horror as liquid fire arced through the air from 150 feet away, bending impossibly into his bunker's firing ports and incinerating men who thought they were safe behind 8 feet of reinforced concrete. His intelligence reports said American flamethrowers could only reach 40 feet, close enough to shoot the operator before the flames arrived. But this napalm stream defied everything he'd been trained to believe. What did Yamamoto discover as a POW that made him realize the M2 flamethrower wasn't just a weapon, but proof that Japan had already lost the war before a single shot was fired? In the autumn of 1944, the island of Peleliu sat like a jagged piece of coral in the vast Pacific Ocean, covered in dense jungle and carved with hundreds of caves and tunnels. The Japanese Empire was running out of time, out of fuel, out of metal, and out of hope. But their soldiers did not know this yet. They had been told that their weapons were superior, that their spirit was unbreakable, and that the Americans were soft men who would collapse under pressure. The radio broadcasts from Tokyo spoke of victories that never happened and weapons that would turn the tide of war. Meanwhile, Japanese factories struggled to produce even basic supplies.
Workers melted down temple bells to make bullets. Gasoline became so rare that pilots trained without ever leaving the ground. The flamethrowers in the Japanese arsenal were old models that could barely shoot fire 25 meters, and they broke down constantly because replacement parts did not exist anymore. Sergeant Takashi Yamamoto had served in the Imperial Army for 8 years. He was 32 years old, a veteran of campaigns in China and the Philippines, and he believed completely in his duty to the Emperor. He had survived battles that killed most of his friends. He had learned to sleep while artillery shells exploded nearby. He knew how to make rice stretch for 3 days instead of 1. He had been taught since childhood that to surrender was the greatest shame a man could bring upon his family, worse than death, worse than anything imaginable. His bunker on Peleliu was his fortress and his tomb, and he had accepted both possibilities with equal calm. The bunker itself was a masterpiece of defensive engineering, at least by the standards of an army that no longer had enough concrete or steel. The walls were 8 feet thick, made from poured concrete reinforced with steel rails torn from destroyed train tracks. The entrance was hidden behind a false wall of coral rock. Inside, 40 men lived in darkness broken only by small oil lamps. They had stacked ammunition boxes to the ceiling. They had dug sleeping spaces into the walls. They had enough rice and dried fish to last 2 months if they were careful. Most importantly, they had multiple firing ports that looked out over the beach where the Americans would have to land. From these narrow slits in the concrete, they could shoot at approaching soldiers while remaining almost completely protected. Yamamoto had studied American tactics carefully. He knew they would come with tanks, with flamethrowers, with explosives. He had seen pictures of the American M1A1 flamethrower in training manuals. The manual said it could shoot fire about 40 feet, maybe 50 if the wind was right. This meant his men could shoot the flamethrower operator before he got close enough to be dangerous. The manual also said American soldiers were poorly trained and relied too much on their equipment instead of their fighting spirit. Yamamoto had told his men this many times. He had explained that if they stayed calm and fired carefully, they could kill the Americans before the Americans even knew where the shots were coming from. The night before the Americans landed, Yamamoto sat in the bunker writing a letter to his wife that he knew she would never receive. He told her about the strength of their position. He told her that the Americans would break themselves against these defenses like waves against a cliff. He did not tell her that he expected to die here, because she already knew that. Every wife of every soldier knew that. The question was never whether he would die, but whether he would die well, with honor, having killed as many enemies as possible. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his uniform pocket, next to a photograph of his two daughters that had been taken 3 years earlier, before the war had consumed everything. On September 15th, the American ships appeared on the horizon just after dawn. Yamamoto ordered his men to their positions. They had practiced this drill 100 times. Each man knew exactly where to go, which firing port to use, how to reload without showing himself to enemy fire. They could hear the naval guns beginning their bombardment, but the shells mostly hit the jungle and the beach. The bunker shook slightly with each nearby explosion, but the thick concrete held. Dust drifted down from the ceiling. The air inside became hot and difficult to breathe, but this was expected. Yamamoto walked among his men, checking their weapons, speaking calmly, reminding them of their training. Some of the younger soldiers were afraid, and he could see it in their eyes, but fear was acceptable as long as it did not turn into panic or cowardice.
The Marines came ashore in waves, exactly as predicted. Yamamoto watched them through his firing port as they ran across the beach, seeking cover behind fallen logs and coral outcroppings. His men began firing in controlled bursts. Americans fell. More Americans came. This was the pattern of modern war, and Yamamoto understood it completely. Then he saw something that made him pause. A group of Marines was approaching with a flamethrower, but they stopped much farther away than they should have. They stopped at a distance where his manual said they could not possibly reach the bunker. He assumed they were confused or poorly trained, just as the manual had promised. Then the fire came. Not a short burst of flame like he expected, but a long stream of liquid that arced through the air like water from a hose, except it was burning. It traveled impossibly far, much farther than any flamethrower he had ever seen or read about. The stream bent slightly in the wind and then poured directly through one of the firing ports. The napalm splashed against the back wall and exploded outward, clinging to everything it touched. 3 men died screaming before Yamamoto could even understand what had happened. The fire did not go out. It kept burning, thick and sticky, spreading across the floor like living evil. This was not gasoline fire. This was something else, something new, something his training had never prepared him for. In that moment, watching his men burn alive from a weapon that should not have been able to reach them, Yamamoto felt the first crack in his certainty, the first whisper of a terrible question he was not yet ready to ask.
The bunker fell 3 days later, not because the Americans stormed it directly, but because they simply walked past it and cut off all escape routes. Yamamoto and 12 surviving men emerged with their hands raised, half-starved and choking on smoke, their uniforms black with soot and dried blood. He had expected to be shot immediately. He had been told that Americans executed prisoners. Instead, a young Marine with red hair gave him water from a canteen and pointed toward a collection area on the beach where other captured Japanese soldiers sat under guard. Yamamoto drank the water slowly, confused by its coldness, confused by the fact that he was still alive, confused by everything that had happened since that first impossible stream of fire had entered his bunker. The journey to Hawaii took 2 weeks on a transport ship. Yamamoto spent most of that time below deck with 300 other prisoners packed into a cargo hold that smelled of salt water and fear. They were given food twice a day, plain but sufficient. Some men refused to eat, believing it was poisoned or that eating American food was a betrayal of the emperor. Yamamoto ate everything they gave him because he understood that whatever was coming next, he would need his strength. At night, in the darkness of the hold, men whispered to each other. They shared stories of the new American flamethrower, the one that shot fire farther than seemed possible. A soldier from Iwo Jima said it could reach even farther than what Yamamoto had seen, maybe 200 feet. Another man said the fire stuck to the skin and could not be put out with water. They spoke of these things in hushed, frightened voices, like children telling ghost stories, except these ghosts were real and had killed their friends. The POW camp in Hawaii sat in a valley surrounded by green mountains that reminded Yamamoto of home, except everything here was bigger and greener and more abundant than anything in Japan. The camp itself was a grid of wooden barracks surrounded by 2 fences topped with barbed wire. Guard towers stood at each corner, but the guards seemed relaxed, almost bored. This confused Yamamoto more than anything else. Where was the hatred? Where was the cruelty he had been promised? On his first day, an American doctor examined him, checking his wounds, listening to his lungs, writing notes on a clipboard. The doctor spoke no Japanese, and Yamamoto spoke no English, but the examination was gentle and professional. The doctor gave him pills for an infection in his leg and used hand gestures to explain that he should take 1 pill twice a day. Yamamoto took the pills, still half expecting them to be poison, still waiting for the punishment that never came. Within a week, he was assigned to a work detail in the camp kitchen. This was where the first real shock hit him, harder than any artillery shell. The kitchen was enormous, larger than any building he had seen in his entire military service. Stainless steel surfaces stretched in every direction. There were machines for peeling potatoes, machines for mixing dough, machines for washing dishes. The ovens were the size of small rooms. The refrigerators hummed constantly, keeping mountains of food cold. Yamamoto had spent the last year of the war eating rice mixed with tree bark because real rice was too valuable. He had watched friends die of malnutrition and diseases caused by hunger. Now he stood in a kitchen that threw away more food in a single day than his entire unit had eaten in a month. An American sergeant named Williams supervised the kitchen detail. He was a heavy man with a thick mustache who spoke slowly and used simple words and hand gestures to communicate with the Japanese prisoners. Williams showed Yamamoto how to operate the industrial dishwasher, a machine that cleaned hundreds of plates in the time it would take 1 man to wash 20 by hand. Williams demonstrated by loading dirty plates on one end and pulling clean, hot plates from the other end just 2 minutes later. He smiled and said something in English that Yamamoto did not understand, but the meaning was clear enough. "This is how we do things. This is normal for us." Yamamoto nodded and tried to hide his amazement, but his hands shook slightly as he loaded the first rack of dishes. The food itself was another revelation. For breakfast, the American soldiers ate eggs, bacon, toast with butter, fresh fruit, and coffee with real sugar. For lunch, there might be roast beef sandwiches, potato salad, cookies, and milk so cold it hurt to drink. For dinner, fried chicken or pork chops, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, bread rolls, and sometimes pie or cake for dessert. The Japanese prisoners ate slightly smaller portions of the same food, and even these smaller portions were more than Yamamoto had eaten in years. He gained weight for the first time since the war began. His wounds healed faster than he thought possible. Other prisoners experienced the same transformation, their hollow cheeks filling out, their strength returning. Some men cried while eating because they remembered friends who had died of starvation on islands where supply ships never arrived. One afternoon in November, a Coca-Cola truck arrived at the camp to deliver cases of soda to the American soldiers. Yamamoto was working near the delivery area and watched as the driver unloaded box after box of glass bottles, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. The driver was whistling. He wore clean clothes and looked well-fed and completely unconcerned about the war. Yamamoto realized with a sudden dizzying clarity that this man, this truck driver, probably had no idea where Peleliu even was. The island where Yamamoto had nearly died, where 40 of his men had burned alive, was so unimportant to America that truck drivers could whistle while delivering soda to soldiers as if nothing remarkable was happening at all. The war that had consumed Yamamoto's entire adult life, that had destroyed his country and killed everyone he knew, was to America just one task among many, barely worth noticing. In December, Sergeant Williams brought a film projector into one of the camp buildings and showed the prisoners an educational film about American manufacturing. The film was meant to teach them about democratic values and peaceful industry, but what Yamamoto saw was something different. The film showed factories that stretched for miles, assembly lines where cars were built in hours instead of months, steel mills that glowed orange day and night, producing more metal in a week than Japan's entire yearly output.
The numbers appeared on screen in English, but a translator prisoner who had lived in California before the war whispered the translations. One Ford factory employed 40,000 workers. One steel mill in Pittsburgh produced 8 million tons per year. America had built 18,000 aircraft in the last year alone. Yamamoto sat in the dark room and felt something break inside his understanding of the world. These numbers were impossible. They had to be propaganda, exaggeration, lies meant to demoralize prisoners. But then he remembered the kitchen, the machines, the Coca-Cola truck, the casual abundance of everything, and he knew the numbers were real. Later that month, Williams gave Yamamoto a task that changed everything. He handed him a technical manual for the M2 flamethrower and asked him, through gestures and broken communication, to help translate it into Japanese for educational purposes. The Americans were creating training materials to teach future Japanese self-defense forces about modern equipment, assuming Japan would eventually be allowed to defend itself again under American supervision. Yamamoto opened the manual carefully, as if it might explode. The diagrams were clear and detailed. The specifications were precise. Maximum range, 150 feet with optimal fuel mixture and pressure. Fuel capacity, 4 gallons of napalm gel. Burn time, 10 seconds of continuous fire. Weight when full, 68 pounds. The manual explained how napalm was created by mixing gasoline with aluminum soap, creating a gel that stuck to surfaces and burned at extremely high temperatures. It explained the pressure system that forced the fuel through the nozzle. It explained the ignition mechanism. Everything was documented, measured, tested, and improved through systematic experimentation. Yamamoto spent 3 days studying that manual, reading and rereading every page. He learned that the M2 was actually the 14th design that American engineers had tested. 13 other flamethrower models had been built, used in combat, evaluated, and then improved or discarded. The manual included a brief history explaining how the M1 had insufficient range, how the M1A1 had reliability problems, how each version was tested in combat and then redesigned based on feedback from soldiers who actually used it in battle. This was the part that Yamamoto could not stop thinking about. America had built 14 different flamethrowers and picked the best one. Japan had built one flamethrower design before the war and kept using it even after it became clear that it barely worked, because redesigning it would have required resources and time, and an admission that the original design was flawed. He shared his discovery with another prisoner named Tanaka, a former lieutenant who had survived the fighting on Iwo Jima. They sat together in the barracks one evening, speaking quietly so the guards would not think they were planning something. Tanaka told him about watching American flamethrower teams work with almost mechanical precision, how they moved in coordinated groups, how they seemed to have unlimited fuel, how they treated the weapon as just another tool rather than something requiring samurai spirit to operate effectively. Yamamoto told Tanaka about the kitchen machines, about the Coca-Cola truck, about the factory film with its impossible numbers. They sat in silence for a long time, both men thinking about the same terrible truth. Japan had not lost the war because Japanese soldiers lacked courage or fighting spirit. Japan had lost because America had so many resources that courage became irrelevant. You could not defeat an enemy who built 14 flamethrowers just to find the best one, who threw away more food than you had ever seen, who could whistle while delivering soda during the largest war in human history. The moment of complete transformation came on a cold morning in late December 1945, 3 months after the war had officially ended. Yamamoto had been transferred to a work detail at Schofield Barracks, a massive military base in central Oahu where American soldiers were being processed for return home. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The emperor himself had spoken on the radio, his voice thin and distant, telling his people that they must endure the unendurable and accept defeat. For Yamamoto, this news had arrived like a blow to the stomach, knocking the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping. Everything he had believed, everything he had fought for, everything that had given his suffering meaning had dissolved in a single moment. He was not a proud warrior who had died defending his emperor. He was a prisoner who had survived, and survival now felt like the deepest shame imaginable. But on this particular December morning, something shifted. Yamamoto was helping to organize equipment in a supply warehouse when an American sergeant approached him. The sergeant's name was Cooper, a thin man with glasses who had been a high school science teacher before the war. Cooper had learned a few words of Japanese from a phrasebook and enjoyed practicing them with the prisoners. He walked over to where Yamamoto was stacking boxes of spare parts and said something in English, then repeated it slowly, using hand gestures.
Yamamoto understood enough to know that Cooper was talking about flamethrowers. Cooper led him to a storage area where several M2 flamethrowers sat on metal racks, their fuel tanks empty, waiting to be shipped somewhere or stored or destroyed. Cooper picked up a technical specification sheet and pointed to various numbers, speaking slowly and carefully. What Cooper said next, translated haltingly through broken Japanese and hand gestures and drawings on a piece of paper, was this. The American military had tested 14 different flamethrower designs during the war. 14 complete models, each one built and used in actual combat and then evaluated. Engineers had interviewed soldiers after every battle, asking what worked and what did not work. They had measured how far the fire traveled, how long the fuel lasted, how heavy the equipment was, how often it broke down, how easily it could be repaired in the field. They had taken all this information and used it to build the next model, and then the next one, and then the next one, always improving, always testing, never satisfied with good enough when better was possible. The M2 was simply the design that scored highest in all categories. It was not a sacred weapon blessed by tradition. It was the winner of a competition where 13 other designs had lost. Cooper smiled as he explained this, clearly proud of American engineering and problem-solving. He seemed to think he was giving Yamamoto interesting information about industrial processes.
He had no idea that his words were destroying the foundation of everything Yamamoto had been taught to believe. Yamamoto stood very still, holding a box of spare parts, feeling something crack open inside his chest. He thought about the Type 93 flamethrower that Japan had used throughout the entire war, the same design from beginning to end, never modified, never improved, breaking down constantly because replacement parts did not exist and the original design had been flawed from the start. He thought about how Japanese soldiers had been told to compensate for bad equipment with good spirit, with courage, with willingness to die. He thought about his men in the bunker on Peleliu, burned alive by a weapon that had been scientifically designed to kill them from a distance where their courage could not possibly matter. That night, in the barracks, Yamamoto sat on his thin mattress and wrote in a small notebook that he had been given by the camp administration. The notebook was meant for learning English vocabulary, but Yamamoto used it as a diary, writing his thoughts in careful Japanese characters. He wrote, "We were told to fear their weakness and their soft lives. We were told that American soldiers had no fighting spirit because they relied on machines instead of on courage.
But I understand now that this was a lie. Or perhaps it was the truth seen backwards. They did not need fighting spirit the way we needed it. They had engineered fighting spirit out of the equation. They built weapons that could kill from 150 feet away, so their soldiers did not need to be brave enough to get within 50 feet. This is not a weakness. This is a different kind of strength, one that we never understood until it had already destroyed us. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He paused, his pen hovering over the paper, and then continued. We were taught that enduring suffering was noble, that accepting hardship made us strong. We were proud of eating rice mixed with bark, proud of fighting with broken equipment, proud of dying for the emperor, even when dying accomplished nothing. The Americans were taught something different. They were taught to eliminate suffering through better design. They were taught that if something breaks, you fix it, or build a better one. They were taught that dying is failure, not honor, and that the goal of war is to make the other side die, instead of making your own side accept death bravely. I do not know which philosophy is correct, but I know which philosophy won the war.
Winter turned slowly toward spring, and Yamamoto's work at Schofield Barracks continued. He was assigned to help maintain equipment, a job he performed carefully and well. The American soldiers treated him with neither cruelty nor particular kindness, simply as a worker doing a necessary job. He was paid a small amount of money in scrip that could be used at the camp store. He bought soap and writing paper and sometimes candy that tasted sweeter than anything he remembered from childhood. One day in February, he was working in a maintenance shed when a group of engineers arrived to inspect some damaged flamethrowers that had been returned from the Pacific Islands. Yamamoto watched from a distance as they examined each weapon carefully, taking notes, measuring parts, and discussing problems. One flamethrower had a cracked fuel line. Another had a faulty pressure gauge. A third had somehow gotten sand in the ignition mechanism. The engineers discussed each problem systematically, talking about how to prevent these issues in future designs, even though the war was over and future designs might never be needed. One of the engineers noticed Yamamoto watching and waved him over. The engineer was young, maybe 25 years old, with oil stains on his uniform and a friendly smile. Through another prisoner who spoke better English, the engineer asked Yamamoto if he had ever seen these weapons in combat. Yamamoto nodded slowly.
The engineer asked what he remembered about them. Yamamoto hesitated, and then through the translator he said, I remember that they could shoot fire much farther than we believed was possible. I remember that we thought we were safe, and then we were not safe. The engineer nodded thoughtfully and said something that the translator repeated. We kept making them shoot farther because we wanted our guys to stay as safe as possible. Every extra foot of range meant our soldiers could stand a little farther back from the enemy. That was the whole point. This simple statement hit Yamamoto like a physical force. The whole point. The purpose of the weapon was not to demonstrate courage or to prove fighting spirit or to honor ancestors or to fulfill duty. The purpose was to keep American soldiers safe while accomplishing the military objective. Everything else was secondary. He thought about how Japanese tactics had required men to get close to the enemy, to accept death as part of the attack, to consider survival as almost shameful compared to a glorious death. He thought about banzai charges where thousands of men ran directly into machine gun fire because retreating was unthinkable. He thought about kamikaze pilots who crashed their planes into ships because Japan did not have enough planes, or pilots, or fuel to fight conventionally anymore. And so they had turned death itself into a weapon. And here was this young American engineer, casually explaining that the entire design philosophy of his weapon was based on keeping soldiers alive. Yamamoto worked in silence for the rest of that day, his hands performing their tasks automatically while his mind processed this new understanding. That evening, he sat with Tanaka and several other prisoners and tried to explain what he had learned. Some men did not want to hear it. They covered their ears or walked away, still clinging to the old beliefs because admitting the truth was too painful. But Tanaka listened carefully, and when Yamamoto finished speaking, Tanaka was quiet for a long time. Finally, Tanaka said, "My brother died in a banzai charge on Saipan. He was 17 years old. He had been in the army for 6 months. They gave him a rifle with 5 bullets and told him to run at American machine guns. He died within 30 seconds of leaving the trench. I have spent 2 years telling myself that his death was honorable and meaningful. But if what you say is true, then his death was just waste. He died because our leaders did not know how to win, and so they told us that dying bravely was the same as winning." The two men sat together as the sun set beyond the mountains, thinking about all the friends they had lost, all the young men who had died believing their deaths meant something important. Yamamoto thought about his own narrow escape from death, how random and meaningless it had been.
If the Marines had attacked his bunker from a different angle, if the flamethrower team had arrived 5 minutes earlier, if the napalm stream had entered through a different firing port, he would have died like his men died. And what would it have meant? Nothing. His death would have changed nothing about the war's outcome. Japan would still have lost. America would still have had unlimited flamethrowers and unlimited fuel and unlimited everything. His courage, or lack of courage, would have been completely irrelevant to the final result. He wrote in his notebook that night, "I believe that we lost because we did not fight hard enough, did not sacrifice enough, did not have enough pure spirit. But this is not true. We lost because we were fighting a country that had so many resources that our fighting spirit could not possibly matter. They had built a system where individual courage was unnecessary because collective industrial power made everything else meaningless. A brave man with a rifle cannot defeat a machine that throws fire 150 feet. Spirit cannot defeat science. Belief cannot defeat abundant resources. This is what the M2 flamethrower taught me. This is what I will remember forever."
The ship that brought Yamamoto back to Japan in April 1946 was an American transport vessel, and this itself felt strange and wrong, like being carried home by the very enemy who had destroyed everything he knew. The journey took 11 days, and Yamamoto spent most of that time on deck, watching the ocean pass beneath the ship's hull, thinking about what waited for him in a country he had not seen in 4 years. Other returning prisoners gathered in small groups, talking in low voices about their fears and hopes, but Yamamoto mostly stayed silent. He carried with him 3 technical manuals that American guards had given him, including the complete specifications for the M2 flamethrower, and 2 notebooks filled with his observations about American manufacturing, agricultural methods, and industrial processes. These items were carefully wrapped in oiled cloth and packed in a small canvas bag that never left his side. They were more valuable to him than any possession he had ever owned, because they represented a kind of knowledge that Japan desperately needed and did not have. When the ship finally entered Yokohama Harbor, Yamamoto stood at the rail and looked at his homeland for the first time since leaving for Peleliu. What he saw made his stomach clench with horror and grief. The city was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed, but simply gone. Erased as if a giant hand had swept it away. Where there had once been buildings and streets and neighborhoods, there was now just flat emptiness scattered with rubble and the blackened foundations of structures that had burned. A few concrete buildings stood like broken teeth among the ruins, but everything else had been reduced to ash and twisted metal. Smoke still rose from some areas, even though the war had been over for 8 months. People moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin and ragged, picking through debris for anything useful. Yamamoto had known intellectually that Japan had been bombed, that cities had been destroyed, but knowing something and seeing it were completely different experiences. This destruction was beyond anything he had imagined, beyond anything his mind could have prepared for. The ship docked, and the returning prisoners were processed through a military checkpoint run by American occupation forces. Japanese officials worked alongside the Americans, checking names against lists, providing information about where families might be located, offering what little assistance they could. Yamamoto learned that his hometown in Hiroshima Prefecture had been completely destroyed by an atomic bomb in August, just days before the surrender. The official who told him this information spoke carefully and gently, as if worried that Yamamoto might collapse or become violent. Yamamoto simply nodded and asked if there.
The moment of complete transformation came on a cold morning in late December 1945, 3 months after the war had officially ended. Yamamoto had been transferred to a work detail at Schofield Barracks, a massive military base in central Oahu where American soldiers were being processed for return home. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The emperor himself had spoken on the radio, his voice thin and distant, telling his people that they must endure the unendurable and accept defeat. For Yamamoto, this news had arrived like a blow to the stomach, knocking the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping. Everything he had believed, everything he had fought for, everything that had given his suffering meaning had dissolved in a single moment. He was not a proud warrior who had died defending his emperor. He was a prisoner who had survived, and survival now felt like the deepest shame imaginable. But on this particular December morning, something shifted. Yamamoto was helping to organize equipment in a supply warehouse when an American sergeant approached him. The sergeant's name was Cooper, a thin man with glasses who had been a high school science teacher before the war. Cooper had learned a few words of Japanese from a phrasebook and enjoyed practicing them with the prisoners. He walked over to where Yamamoto was stacking boxes of spare parts and said something in English, then repeated it slowly, using hand gestures. When he finally reached the village, he found his family living in a single room of a farmer's house, sharing the space with 2 other families. Keiko had aged 10 years in the 4 years he had been gone. His daughters, now 9 and 11, barely remembered him and seemed frightened of this thin stranger who claimed to be their father. The reunion was quiet and awkward, filled with long silences and careful politeness instead of joy or relief. Yamamoto gave them the small amount of money he had earned as a prisoner, American dollars that would need to be exchanged on the black market because regular currency had become almost worthless. He gave them a bar of soap and some candy he had saved from the POW camp. The girls ate the candy slowly, making each piece last, their eyes wide with wonder at the sweetness. Keiko cried silently, not from happiness, but from the overwhelming weight of everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. That first night, lying on a thin mat beside his sleeping family, Yamamoto listened to the sounds of the village and thought about the contrast between this and the POW camp in Hawaii. There, he had eaten more food in a day than his daughters would see in a week.
There, machines had washed dishes and peeled potatoes and mixed dough, while here people scraped by with hand tools and animal labor and methods that had not changed in centuries. There, casual abundance had been so normal that Americans had not even noticed it, while here desperate scarcity was crushing people who had no strength left to resist. The gap between the two worlds was so vast that Yamamoto could barely comprehend it, and he had seen both sides with his own eyes. How could anyone who had not experienced both worlds possibly understand how unequal the contest had been? In the weeks that followed, Yamamoto began working as a translator and technical advisor for the American occupation forces.
His knowledge of English was limited, but his understanding of technical manuals and industrial processes made him valuable. He helped translate documents about agricultural equipment, manufacturing processes, and construction techniques. The Americans were trying to rebuild Japan, not out of kindness, but because a stable Japan served American interests better than a chaotic one. They brought in equipment and supplies and expertise, and they needed Japanese workers who could understand technical instructions and operate modern machinery. Yamamoto's experience in the POW camp, his careful study of American methods, his notebooks filled with observations about efficiency and systems, all of this made him exactly the kind of person the occupation forces needed.
One day in July 1946, an American engineer named Morrison asked Yamamoto to help evaluate a Japanese factory that had somehow survived the bombing. The factory had made aircraft parts during the war, and the Americans wanted to know if it could be converted to produce agricultural equipment instead. Yamamoto and Morrison walked through the facility together, and Morrison explained what changes would be needed, what equipment would have to be replaced, how the workflow could be reorganized to manufacture tractors instead of airplane components. Yamamoto translated and took notes. But what struck him most was Morrison's casual assumption that of course the factory could be fixed, of course it could be made efficient, of course problems had solutions if you just thought about them systematically and applied proper engineering principles. This attitude, this fundamental optimism about the possibility of improvement, was completely foreign to Yamamoto's experience of Japanese culture, where problems were often seen as unchangeable facts to be endured, rather than challenges to be solved. As the months passed and turned into years, Yamamoto found himself becoming a bridge between two completely different ways of thinking. He trained young Japanese workers in American manufacturing methods. He explained concepts like quality control, systematic testing, continuous improvement, and efficiency analysis. Many older workers resisted these ideas, insisting that traditional methods were sufficient, that Japanese craftsmanship was superior to American mass production. But younger workers, especially those who had seen the destruction of the war, were hungry for new approaches. They understood that the old ways had failed completely and catastrophically, and they were willing to try something different.
Winter turned slowly toward spring, and Yamamoto's work at Schofield Barracks continued. He was assigned to help maintain equipment, a job he performed carefully and well. The American soldiers treated him with neither cruelty nor particular kindness, simply as a worker doing a necessary job. He was paid a small amount of money in scrip that could be used at the camp store. He bought soap and writing paper and sometimes candy that tasted sweeter than anything he remembered from childhood. One day in February, he was working in a maintenance shed when a group of engineers arrived to inspect some damaged flamethrowers that had been returned from the Pacific Islands. Yamamoto watched from a distance as they examined each weapon carefully, taking notes, measuring parts, and discussing problems. One flamethrower had a cracked fuel line. Another had a faulty pressure gauge. A third had somehow gotten sand in the ignition mechanism. The engineers discussed each problem systematically, talking about how to prevent these issues in future designs, even though the war was over and future designs might never be needed. One of the engineers noticed Yamamoto watching and waved him over. The engineer was young, maybe 25 years old, with oil stains on his uniform and a friendly smile. Through another prisoner who spoke better English, the engineer asked Yamamoto if he had ever seen these weapons in combat. Yamamoto nodded slowly.
Yamamoto became their teacher and guide, showing them not just how to operate American machines, but how to think like American engineers, always asking how things could be done better, faster, more efficiently, with less waste and more output. By 1950, Yamamoto had become the manager of a small factory that produced farming tools. The factory employed 40 workers, and Yamamoto ran it using principles he had learned by watching Americans work. He organized the production line to minimize wasted motion. He created systems for checking quality at multiple points in the process. He held weekly meetings where workers could suggest improvements, and he actually implemented the good suggestions, which was revolutionary in a culture where workers were expected to follow orders without question. The factory's output doubled in the first year under his management, and other factory owners began asking how he had achieved such improvement. Yamamoto gave lectures to business groups, explaining that the secret was not working harder, but working smarter, using systems and measurements and constant small improvements instead of relying on individual effort and endurance. In 1955, Yamamoto was invited to speak at a technical college in Osaka. The audience was mostly young engineering students, and Yamamoto had been asked to talk about his experiences with American manufacturing methods. He stood at the front of the classroom, now 43 years old, his hair starting to gray, and looked at these young faces that reminded him of the soldiers he had commanded in the bunker on Peleliu. He had not planned to talk about the war. He had prepared a lecture about factory efficiency and quality control. But standing there, looking at these students who would help rebuild Japan, he found himself telling a different story.
He told them about the M2 flamethrower. He described its specifications, its range, its effectiveness, and the systematic process that had created it through multiple iterations and constant improvement. He explained how American engineers had built 14 different models and chosen the best one, while Japan had built one model and never improved it, even when its flaws became obvious. He told them about the moment in the bunker when he realized that his courage and his training and his fighting spirit were completely irrelevant in the face of a weapon that could kill from 150 feet away. And then he said something that he had been thinking about for 9 years, but had never spoken aloud until that moment. He said, "I learned in captivity what I could not learn in battle. I learned that the flamethrower's 150-foot range was not just engineering, it was mercy. The Americans could have made weapons that required their soldiers to get closer, to be braver, to risk more. But instead, they made weapons that eliminated the need for that kind of courage. They built systems that brought their soldiers home alive, instead of systems that turned death into honor. When I understood this, I finally understood why we lost the war. We built a culture that celebrated suffering and endurance. They built a culture that eliminated suffering through better design. We asked our soldiers how brave they could be. They asked their engineers how safe they could keep their soldiers. We treated courage as the solution to every problem. They treated courage as evidence that the problem had not been solved correctly."
The classroom was completely silent. Some students were writing furiously in notebooks. Others sat motionless, staring at Yamamoto with expressions that ranged from shock to anger to dawning understanding. Yamamoto continued, his voice steady and calm. "I am not saying that courage is worthless or that honor is meaningless. I am saying that courage and honor are not substitutes for good design and abundant resources and systematic improvement. Japan must learn to ask different questions. Not how much can our people endure, but how can we make endurance unnecessary? Not how bravely can our workers labor, but how can we build machines that make their labor more productive? Not how much should we sacrifice, but how can we build a system where sacrifice is no longer required?" One student raised his hand and asked, "Are you saying we should become like Americans? Should we abandon our culture and our values?" Yamamoto shook his head. He said, "I am saying we should learn what they did right while keeping what is valuable in our own traditions. American abundance came from asking better questions and building better systems. Those questions and systems are not uniquely American. They're simply effective. We can adopt effective methods while remaining Japanese. In fact, we must adopt them if we want Japan to survive and prosper. The world has changed.
Wars are now won by industrial capacity and scientific thinking, not by fighting spirit alone. We can either learn this lesson, or we can be destroyed by refusing to learn it.
After the lecture, several students approached Yamamoto with more questions. One young man asked if he still felt shame about being captured instead of dying in battle. Yamamoto thought carefully before answering. He said, "I felt shame for many years, but now I understand that my survival was not weakness. My survival allowed me to learn lessons that dead heroes cannot learn. If I had died in that bunker, I would have died believing that we lost because we did not fight hard enough. Instead, I survived and learned the truth. I learned that we lost because we were fighting a war we could never win, using methods that had become obsolete, guided by ideas that made sense in the past but failed completely in the modern world. This knowledge is more valuable than an honorable death. This knowledge can help rebuild Japan into something stronger than it was before." In the decades that followed, Japan's economic recovery became known as a miracle, but Yamamoto knew it was not a miracle at all. It was simply the result of asking the right questions and applying systematic thinking to problems that had once seemed unsolvable. The generation of engineers and managers that rebuilt Japan had learned lessons similar to what Yamamoto had learned in the POW camp, that efficiency matters more than endurance, that systems matter more than individual heroism, that continuous improvement through testing and measurement produces better results than rigid adherence to tradition. They had learned to ask how things could be done better rather than accepting that things could only be done one way. Yamamoto retired in 1972 at the age of 60. By then, Japan had become the second largest economy in the world, exporting cars and electronics and machinery to every continent. The factory he had managed now employed 300 workers and used computer-controlled equipment that would have seemed like science fiction in 1946. His daughters had graduated from university, something that would have been impossible for women of his generation. His grandchildren grew up in a Japan of prosperity and peace, never knowing hunger or fear or the sound of bombs falling from the sky.
In his final years, Yamamoto often thought about the men who had died in the bunker on Peleliu, burned alive by napalm that reached them from an impossible distance. He thought about what they might have become if they had survived, what they might have built, what they might have contributed to Japan's recovery. Their deaths had meant nothing in the end. Japan had not been saved by their sacrifice. It had been rebuilt by people like Yamamoto who had survived and learned and adapted and changed. The M2 flamethrower had killed his men, but it had also taught him the most important lesson of his life, that the future belongs not to those who endure suffering most bravely, but to those who build systems that make suffering unnecessary. That lesson, purchased with the lives of 40 good men in a concrete bunker on a forgotten island, had been worth learning. Yamamoto had spent the rest of his life making sure that their deaths, however meaningless in the moment, would produce meaning through what he taught others about why they died and how their deaths could prevent future deaths by changing how Japan thought about strength, power, and the true meaning of protecting one's country. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.